December 1287. The sky over Eastern Europe was the color of iron, heavy and unforgiving, and beneath it 30,000 Mongol horsemen crossed into Poland as if winter itself had unleashed them. Their horses exhaled white clouds into the frozen air, hooves crunching over hardened earth, leather armor creaking, bows resting across saddles like extensions of their riders' arms. This was not just another raid. This was the return of a force that Europe had once believed to be the end of days. These were the descendants of Genghis Khan, heirs to the most terrifying war machine the medieval world had ever seen. An empire that had thundered out of the steppes and swallowed kingdoms whole. From the Pacific shores of Asia to the gates of Vienna, their banners had ridden the wind. They had shattered the armies of China. They had reduced the great cities of Persia to smoldering ruin. They had trampled the Russian principalities into submission and left entire regions whispering their name in fear. When Mongol scouts appeared on your horizon, it did not mean battle. It meant devastation, and Poland knew this better than most. Twice before, the Mongols had come. Twice before, they had carved their way through Polish lands like a blade through cloth. The first time, in 1241, the invasion was apocalyptic. Towns burned so quickly that smoke from one city could be seen from the walls of the next. Knights rode out with banners flying, convinced they could defend Christendom, only to vanish beneath storms of arrows. The Battle of Legnica, where Duke Henry II fell, his body so mutilated his own wife could identify him only by counting his toes, had become a wound etched into the Polish soul. Children grew up hearing that story as a warning. Resist and you die. Charge and you are surrounded. Stand proud and your head ends up on a spear. The Mongols had shown them no mercy. Cities like Krakow were reduced to ashes. Wooden fortifications that had protected generations proved worthless against fire and siege. Entire villages disappeared. Survivors fled west with horror in their eyes and stories that sounded like prophecy. Horsemen who could shoot while galloping, armies that pretended to run only to encircle you, commanders who seemed to know your defenses better than you did yourself. Then they came again in 1259. And again, the pattern repeated. Swift, precise, ruthless. Sanders, Lublin, Krakow, sacked, burned, broken. The message was clear. When the Mongols chose to strike, resistance was suicide. S. Owen, in late 1287, scouts rode hard into Polish towns with news that Mongol forces were gathering once more beyond the eastern frontier. Fear spread like wildfire ahead of them. It was not distant history. It was living memory. Grandparents who had seen the first invasion were still alive. Fathers remembered hiding as children while their homes burned. The words, "they're coming," carried the weight of nightmares. And this time the army was massive. 30,000 warriors under two powerful commanders, Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan. Men who had every reason to believe Poland would crumble as it had before. Why wouldn't it? The Mongol strategy had not failed them anywhere else. They would split their forces into two great columns, move with blinding speed, overwhelm local defenses before coordination was possible, plunder everything of value, capture thousands for slavery, and vanish back into Ruthenia before winter could trap them. It was a plan polished by decades of success. Talabuga would drive north with 20,000 men, including Ruthenian vassals bound to Mongol command. Nogai would lead 10,000 elite cavalry south toward Krakow itself, Poland's beating heart. The idea was simple and devastating. Strike from two directions, prevent unified defense, see Sanders, converge near Krakow, crush the capital, and withdraw with riches and prisoners. Quick, brutal, efficient. The Mongols were masters of this rhythm. Their cavalry was unlike anything Europe had known. Every rider had grown up in the saddle. They could loose arrows at full gallop with terrifying accuracy. They traveled light, each warrior bringing multiple horses to rotate for endurance. They communicated through signals, horns, and disciplined formations. And most deadly of all, they understood deception. The feigned retreat had destroyed countless armies. Engage briefly. Turn and flee. Let pride and adrenaline pull the enemy into pursuit. Then, when formations broke and lines stretched thin, wheel around. Hidden flanking units would surge from cover. The hunters would become the hunted in a matter of seconds. What looked like victory dissolved into encirclement and annihilation. It had worked against the Poles in 1241. It had worked against the Hungarians. It had worked almost everywhere. And beyond tactics, the Mongols possessed something even more chilling: knowledge. They did not invade blindly. Scouts moved years in advance, mapping terrain, identifying political divisions, noting fortifications, studying supply routes. By the time their main force crossed a border, they often knew more about a kingdom's weaknesses than its own rulers did. They knew which dukes distrusted each other, which cities were poorly defended, which roads allowed rapid cavalry movement. As Talabuga and Nogai advanced in December 1287, confidence ran through their ranks like fire through dry grass. Poland had been easy prey: fragmented leadership, wooden walls, reckless knights. Why should this winter be any different? Villages in their path were erased. Farms burned. Those too slow to flee were cut down or chained. Refugees flooded toward fortified towns, spreading panic faster than the Mongol horses themselves. The air carried the same dread it had nearly half a century earlier. Mothers gathered children. Priests prayed. Noble wigged impossible choix. Fight and risk slaughter. Flee and abandon everything. From the Mongol perspective, the campaign was unfolding exactly as expected. But beneath the fear, beneath the memory of ashes, something had changed, something the Mongols did not see. Because after 1241, after 1259, after burying their dead and sifting through charred ruins, Polish leaders had faced a truth too brutal to ignore. If they did not transform, they would be destroyed again and again. And this time, when the horsemen crossed the border, Poland was not the same nation they had burned before. When the smoke cleared after the first Mongol invasions, Poland did something that most broken nations fail to do. It did not simply rebuild. It studied its own destruction. The memory of 1241 was not romanticized. It was dissected. Wooden walls had burned in hours. Isolated dukes had fought alone and died alone. Knights had charged with courage, but without coordination, only to be swallowed by feigned retreats and arrow storms. Poland's weakness had not been bravery. It had been structured so they began to change that structure. Across Lesser Poland, timber palisades were torn down and replaced with stone. Not decorative stone, not symbolic stone, military stone. Walls thick enough to resist rams. Towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire. Gatehouses reinforced with iron and murder holes. Krakow underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. The old wooden citadel that had once burned so easily was replaced by a full stone castle, its walls rising high and cold against the skyline, designed specifically with Mongol tactics in mind. This wasn't fashion. This was an imitation of Western Europe. This was survival engineering, because Polish leaders had realized something fundamental. The Mongol army's greatest strength, speed, became a liability during prolonged sieges. The Mongols thrived in open terrain. They dominated in mobility. They shattered armies in the field. But sieges tied them down. Sieges consumed time. Sieges drained supplies. Sieges neutralized cavalry advantage. A horse archer could not gallop through a stone wall. A feigned retreat meant nothing to a garrison that refused to leave its battlements. And Poland's new strategy revolved around exactly that refusal. WY 1287. The man tasked with defending the realm was Leszek II the Black. He was not the most glamorous ruler in Europe. He did not command the largest army. But he understood something that earlier Polish leaders had not fully grasped. You do not fight the Mongols on their terms. When intelligence reached him that Talabuga and Nogai were gathering forces beyond the frontier, Leszek did not rush east with banners flying. He did not assemble a massive field army and gamble everything on one decisive clash. That was exactly what the Mongols wanted. Instead, he implemented a three-stage defensive plan that was deceptively simple and devastatingly effective. First, concentrate forces inside fortified strongholds. Let the Mongols come. Let them slam into stone walls that would not burn. Second, use smaller local units to harass detached raiding parties. Do not engage the full Mongol host, but if they split, punish them. Third, once the invaders were exhausted, frustrated, and stretched thin, deliver a concentrated counterstrike with unified forces that it was a strategy built on patience, on discipline, on denying the enemy what they wanted. Leszek commanded roughly 15,000 troops. On paper, that was half the invading force. Against 30,000 Mongols in open battle, defeat would have been likely. But Leszek was not fighting the Mongols of 1241. He was fighting a divided army under two ambitious commanders who were not coordinating as closely as they should. Talabuga's northern column entered Poland first on December 7th, 1287. 20,000 men, Ruthenian auxiliaries riding alongside Mongol cavalry. They bypassed certain targets deliberately, avoiding unnecessary sieges, driving towards Sandomierz with speed and confidence. Villages fell. Panic spread. The pattern seemed familiar, but when they reached Sandomierz and prepared for assault, the script faltered. The Mongols expected wooden walls. They found stone. The defenders did not sally out recklessly. They did not panic. They did not attempt glorious but suicidal cavalry charges. They stayed behind battlements reinforced after decades of preparation. Crossbows lined the walls. Catapults stood ready. Arrows from Mongol riders struck stone and lost their menace. Assault parties advanced and were cut down. Siege engines battered and walls held. Again and again, Talabuga's forces tried to break Sandomierz quickly. They could not. And every hour that passed was a small strategic victory for Poland. Every hour meant the Mongol timetable slipped further behind. Frustrated, Talabuga altered course. If Sandomierz would not fall swiftly, he would seek easier targets. The army shifted toward the Swiatek-Krzyski Mountains, eyeing the wealthy abbeys and settlements in that region. But something else began happening, something subtle yet corrosive. Polish forces shadowed them, not in one grand army. In fragments, small units, mounted scouts, local militias familiar with the terrain. They struck supply detachments, ambushed stragglers, harassed foraging parties, never committing fully, never giving the Mongols a decisive engagement, like wolves circling a wounded animal. Then came December 20th, near a place called Wachok. The terrain here was not open steppe. It was uneven, wooded, restrictive, not ideal ground for sweeping cavalry maneuvers. Leszek had been tracking Talabuga carefully. He knew the northern column had been weakened by detachments sent out to raid. He knew their numbers were no longer concentrated, and he saw his moment. When Polish forces intercepted the Mongols near Wachok, this was not a panicked defense. This was a calculated engagement. The Mongols expected the usual response: a reckless charge, broken formations, an opportunity for feigned retreat. Instead, they encountered disciplined resistance. Polish troops held formation. They used terrain to restrict flanking. Crossbowmen targeted riders before they could close distance. Heavy cavalry waited for controlled counterattacks rather than impulsive pursuit. When Mongol units attempted their trademark maneuvers, they found their avenues of movement channeled into narrow spaces. The sweeping arcs of encirclement were blunted. Instead of fluid dominance, the battle became a grinding clash, prolonged, brutal, attritional. Exactly the type of fight the Mongols preferred to avoid. For hours, combat raged. Arrows flew. Horses screamed. Steel met steel in close quarters. But as the struggle wore on, something astonishing began to unfold. The Mongols began to falter. Losses mounted. The quick breakthrough never came. Morale, once built on inevitability, cracked under resistance they had not anticipated. Talabuga's forces, unable to secure victory, began to withdraw, and that withdrawal did not remain orderly. That it became a retreat. Polish chronicles describe the defeat as severe, which in medieval understatement likely means catastrophic. Talabuga's column, bloodied and shaken, pulled back toward Kielce and eventually retreated all the way to Lviv by January 1288. Think about what that means. The Mongols, conquerors of empires, had been defeated in open battle on Polish soil, For the first time in this long, bitter history, it was not Poland that was running at it was the invaders. But the campaign was far from over. While Talabuga's forces limped east, Nogai Khan's southern column was still advancing toward Krakow, unaware that the northern wing of their invasion had already cracked, and what awaited Nogai outside the stone walls of Krakow would test Mongol confidence even further. December 24th, 1287. Snow clung to the ground outside Krakow, thin but sharp underhoof. The air was bitter, and beneath that pale winter sky, Nogai Khan's 10,000 elite cavalry arrived before the capital of Poland. This was supposed to be the decisive stroke. While Talabuga's northern column swept through lesser Poland, Nogai would seize the heart. Krakow would fall, just as it had before, and the campaign would end in predictable triumph. Nogai was no reckless subordinate. He was one of the most powerful figures of the Golden Horde, a seasoned commander who had campaigned across Eastern Europe and the Balkans. His force was smaller than Talabuga's, but it was purer, elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry, hardened veterans who had broken cities from the Danube to the Black Sea. No questionable auxiliaries, no divided loyalty, just disciplined, mounted killers. And in his memory, Krakow was not an obstacle. It was a precedent that in 1241, it had burned, that in 1259, it had burned again. Why should this time be any different? But when Nogai's riders spread out before the city, they saw something that must have unsettled them. The skyline had changed. The castle that once stood vulnerable behind timber and earth now rose in cold, unyielding stone. Walls thick and high, towers placed deliberately. No exposed timber ready to catch fire. No fragile gates begging to be battered through in hours. This was not the Krakow of their fathers' victories. That it was a fortress. Nogai did what Mongol commanders always did. He tested it. Horse archers advanced in waves, loosing volleys meant to suppress defenders and create openings. But the arrows struck stone and iron. Defenders did not scatter. They responded. Crossbows fired from battlements with range and penetrating force. Bolts slamming into riders before they could withdraw. Catapults hurled stones down into Mongol formations, breaking horses, crushing men, forcing rapid dispersal. Nogai escalated. Assault parties advanced with ladders. Siege equipment rolled forward, but every approach lane had been calculated. The defenders had overlapping angles of fire. Projectiles rained down from multiple directions. Any unit that came too close found itself trapped in a lethal corridor. The first assault failed. The second failed. The third broke under heavy loss. This was not how Mongol campaigns were supposed to unfold. Speed was their weapon. Shock was their currency. A city that did not fall quickly disrupted the entire rhythm of the invasion. Days passed. Supplies diminished. Winter deepened. The men outside the walls consumed food meant for mobility, not stagnation. Horses required fodder. Fires burned constantly in the cold. Every sunrise without victory was a silent accusation. And inside Krakow, the defenders held. Whether or not the legend is true, it captures the spirit of the moment. The tale speaks of the Lajkonik, river raftsmen from the Vistula who launched a surprise night raid on the Mongol encampment, killing commanders and spreading chaos. Historians debate the details, but what is certain is this: something went wrong for Nogai's army outside Krakow. Casualties were heavier than expected. Leadership was shaken. The siege failed, and Nogai made a decision that Mongol commanders rarely had to make, that he abandoned the assault. Instead of seizing Krakow in days, he divided his forces into smaller raiding detachments, hoping to salvage plunder from the surrounding countryside. It was a fallback strategy, not victory, but damage control. If the capital could not be taken, at least the land could be stripped bare. But by doing so, Nogai made the same mistake Talabuga had already paid for. He dispersed strength. Meanwhile, to the north, Leszek II was not celebrating prematurely. After defeating Talabuga at Wachok, he understood the campaign was only half won. Nogai's column still operated in the south. Krakow still faced danger, and speed now mattered as much to Poland as it once had to the Mongols. Messengers rode hard toward Hungary. Poland's southern neighbor had suffered its own devastation in 1241. Entire regions depopulated, cities burned, lessons learned in blood. Hungary understood the Mongol threat intimately, and they had rebuilt with stone as well. The response came. Hungarian forces under Voivode George Baksa marched north to join Leszek. This was not a fragmented Poland of earlier decades. This was coordination. This was alliance. This was the beginning of unified resistance. And somewhere in southern Poland, in January 1288, a Mongol raiding force of roughly 1,000 men found itself besieging the town of Stary Sachs. They likely believed they were safe. They likely believed the main Polish army was still scattered. They likely did not know Talabuga had retreated. They certainly did not expect what came next. Leszek and the Hungarian cavalry arrived with speed and surprise. And in that moment, the Mongols experienced something painfully familiar, but from the wrong side. Shock. The Allied army descended on the besieging force before it could form properly. No time for feigned retreat. No time for coordinated maneuver. No room to stretch into cavalry arcs. The Mongols were caught compressed, unprepared, and outnumbered. The battle was not prolonged, it was annihilation. The entire detachment was destroyed. Its commander killed. There was no orderly withdrawal. No calculati retreat. Just destruction. When news reached Nogai that one of his raiding forces had been wiped out, that Talabuga had already withdrawn, that Polish and Hungarian forces were now operating aggressively in the field, the truth became impossible to ignore. The campaign had collapsed. The script had reversed. Instead of Poland fragmenting under pressure, it had unified. Instead of Mongol mobility dominating the countryside, it was being constrained by stone and disciplined counterattack. Instead of fear paralyzing defenders, it had hardened them. Nogai made the only rational choice left: full retreat. In late January 1288, what remained of his army withdrew toward Ruthenia, not laden with treasure, not driving columns of captives, but carrying the weight of failure. And here is what makes this moment historic. After this campaign, after 1287 to 1288, the Mongols never invaded Poland again. Not once. The nation that had burned twice before had transformed itself into something not worth the cost of invasion. When Nogai's army crossed back into Ruthenia in early 1288, something more than a campaign had ended. A pattern had been broken. For nearly half a century, the Mongol invasions of Poland followed a grim rhythm. Enter fast, split forces, overwhelm cities, destroy field armies, withdraw with loot and captives. It worked in 1241. It worked again in 1259. And when Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan prepared their winter campaign in 1287, they assumed they were repeating a formula that had never failed. But they were not fighting the Poland of 1241, they were fighting a Poland that had adapted. And that adaptation struck at the heart of Mongol strategy. First, the internal division. Talabuga and Nogai were both powerful leaders within the Golden Horde. Neither wanted to subordinate himself fully to the other. So instead of one unified army of 30,000 operating with synchronized precision, the invasion moved in two semi-independent columns. Communication was slow. Coordination was limited. When Talabuga was defeated at Wachok and began retreating, Nogai did not immediately know the full extent of the disaster, by the time Nogai stood outside Krakow, attempting to break stone walls. His northern support had already evaporated. That mattered. The Mongol war machine was terrifying when unified. When dispersed without coordination, it became vulnerable to defeat in detail. The Polish strategy exploited exactly that. Leszek too did not attempt to crush 30,000 at once. He broke them apart. First Talabuga, then isolated detachments, then Nogai's raiders. Second, and more importantly, the fortifications. The stone castles of Krakow, Sandomierz, and other strongholds were not ornamental upgrades. They were deliberate counters to Mongol operational tempo. In 1241, wooden walls burned quickly. Cities fell in days. Mongol columns could move continuously, never bogged down, always advancing. In 1287, every siege consumed time. and time was poisoned for Mongol campaigns. The Mongol army was built for mobility. Their supply system relied heavily on movement, on grazing lands, on rapid advance and withdrawal. When forced to remain stationary outside stone walls, their advantages evaporated. Horses required fodder. Men required food. Cold deepened. Attrition mounted. The longer they sat before Krakow or Sandomierz, the more the initiative shifted to Poland, and Poland understood that shift-at-Lessek's three-stage strategy worked almost perfectly. Stage 1. Fortresses hold. Sandomierz did not collapse. Krakow did not burn. The psychological script, Mongols appear, city falls, was broken. Stage 2. Harassment. Local Polish forces shadowed Mongol detachments. They did not fight suicidal open battles. They waited for opportunities. They struck isolated units. They forced the Mongols to move cautiously. Even small skirmishes chipped away at morale. Stage 3. Concentrated counterstrike. Wachak, Talabuga's army, was forced into terrain that limited maneuverability. Polish forces held formation, resisted feigned retreats, and turned the battle into attrition. The Mongols broke Stary Sachs. A raiding detachment was annihilated by a combined Polish-Hungarian force. Surprise! The very weapon Mongols had used for decades was turned against them, and that alliance with Hungary was not accidental. Hungary had suffered terribly in 1241 as well. Entire regions depopulated. King Bela IV had rebuilt his kingdom with stone fortresses, just as Poland had done. The Hungarians had learned the same lessons. So when Hungarian cavalry joined Lessek's forces, it was not merely reinforcement. It was two nations forged by Mongol fire standing together. This was no longer fragmented resistance, that it was coordinated defense. Now think about the psychological impact. For decades, the Mongols had cultivated an aura of inevitability. Cities sometimes surrendered before a single arrow was loosed because resistance seemed pointless. The memory of Legnica, of Duke Henry II slain and his head displayed, haunted Polish identity. It symbolized helplessness, but in 1287 to 1288, something shifted. The Mongols were defeated in open battle. Their siege of Krakow failed. Their raiders were destroyed. They retreated without achieving strategic objectives. And perhaps most telling of all, they never returned. Not once did a Mongol army attempt another major invasion of Poland after this campaign. That silence speaks louder than any chronicle. For an empire that had ridden from East Asia to Eastern Europe, avoiding Poland afterward was a calculated choice. Why? Because the cost-benefit analysis had changed. Poland was no longer an easy source of plunder. It was a fortified, coordinated, prepared target. Stone walls meant prolonged sieges. Unified leadership meant organized resistance. Alliances meant reinforcements. There were easier lands to raid, territories less prepared, less hardened. The Mongols did not stop because they were destroyed. They stopped because Poland was no longer worth the cost, and that may be the most powerful form of victory. Within Poland, the effects went deeper than military pride. The invasions had exposed the dangers of fragmentation. Multiple dukes ruling semi-independent territories without centralized command. The success of 1287 to 1288 demonstrated the power of unified leadership under Leszek II. That momentum toward political consolidation continued in the following decades. In 1320, the Ladislaw I the Elbow High was crowned king, restoring the Polish kingdom as a unified monarchy after generations of division. The Mongol threat had indirectly accelerated Polish state formation. Trauma had forged identity, and culturally, the memory endured that in Krakow, the Lajkonic tradition, a colorful annual parade, commemorates the legendary defeat of Mongol forces outside the city. A figure dressed in stylized Eastern costume rides through the streets, symbolizing the transformation of terror into triumph. Whether every detail of the legend is historically precise matters less than what it represents. Survival. The Mongols recorded their great victories carefully. Their conquests across Asia and Europe are chronicled in detail. But the failed Polish campaign receives little emphasis. Empires remember triumphs. Nations remember survival. And this is where the deeper lesson lies. Poland did not win because it suddenly became militarily superior to the Mongols. It did not field more cavalry. It did not invent revolutionary new weapons. It did something more powerful that IT learned, that IT analyzed its defeats in 1241 and 1259. It identified its vulnerabilities: wooden fortifications, fragmented command, impulsive tactics. And over decades, it systematically corrected them. Every burned wall became stone. Every reckless charge became disciplined defense. Every isolated duchy moved one step closer to unity. The Mongols relied on a system that had worked brilliantly across continents. But when confronted by an enemy that had studied them, that had prepared specifically to counter them, their system stalled. Adaptation beat momentum. And that is why this campaign echoes through history, because it proves that even the most feared war machine can be stopped, not by luck, not by miracle, but by preparation, patience, and a refusal to repeat past mistakes. When Nogai Khan rode east in early 1288, retreating from Poland without triumph, he wasn't returning to a united, unstoppable empire. He was returning to a Mongol world that was already cracking from within. By the late 13th century, the empire built by Genghis Khan was no longer the single, roaring force that had once swept across Eurasia. It had fractured into powerful khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Western Steppes. They were still formidable, still dangerous, but no longer perfectly unified. And inside the Golden Horde itself, power struggles simmered. Nogai Khan was not just a general. He was a kingmaker, a political force who often rivaled the official Khan in influence. Talabuga, who led the northern column into Poland, was technically the reigning Khan, but his authority was fragile. Rivalries, ambitions, and distrust shaped their campaign in subtle but decisive ways. And that matters, because the Mongol military machine was at its most terrifying when it operated with iron unity of command. When Subutai coordinated multi-pronged invasions in the 1240s, they moved like clockwork across thousands of miles. Armies separated and reunited with precision. Intelligence flowed. Reinforcements arrived on time. In 1287, that machine was no longer perfectly synchronized. Talabuga and Nogai did not function as a single mind. They advanced separately. They fought separately. They retreated separately. When Talabuga was defeated at Wachok, Nogai was still committing to a prolonged siege of Krakow, unaware that the northern wing had already collapsed. Imagine if those 30,000 riders had converged fully before engaging. Imagine if Krakow had been attacked with the weight of both columns. Poland might have faced a different outcome. But history rarely turns on raw numbers alone. It turns on timing, leadership, and cohesion. And in 1287, the Mongols lacked the seamless coordination that had defined their earlier conquests. Now here's where this story connects to something even larger. The Mongol invasions of Europe in 1241 had terrified the continent not just because of their brutality, but because they seemed unstoppable. After crushing Poland at Legnica and Hungary at Mohi, they stood at the edge of the Holy Roman Empire. Western Europe braced for annihilation. Then, suddenly, they withdrew, not because they were defeated in battle, but because Ogedai Khan, the great Khan in Mongolia, had died. Mongol princes were required to return east to participate in the Kurultai, the election of a new supreme ruler. Europe was spared not by resistance, but by Mongol politics. That detail haunted European memory. IT meant that survival had been accidental. If the great Khan had lived longer, what would have happened to Vienna? To Rome? To Paris? So for decades, the Mongols remained a looming shadow. Even when they did not invade, the fear remained that one day they might return, fully committed, fully united, unstoppable again. But by 1287, the situation was different. This time, Poland did not survive because of Mongol internal summons. That IT survived because it fought and won. That distinction changed perception. For the first time, a European kingdom had not merely endured the Mongols. It had adapted to defeat them, and Poland wasn't alone in this adaptation. Hungary, after being devastated, in 1241, had undergone its own transformation under King Bela IV. Stone fortresses multiplied, defensive networks strengthened, military reforms reshaped the kingdom. Hungary became far harder to raid than it had been in the early 1240s. Across Eastern Europe, lessons were being absorbed. The Mongols had conquered vast territories with speed and psychological shock. But shock fades when enemies learn what to expect. Feigned retreats work brilliantly until opponents refuse to pursue. Rapid sieges succeed until walls are rebuilt in stone. Terror paralyzes until memory transforms fear into preparation. And here is the deeper irony. The Mongols had taught Europe how to defend against the Mongols. Poland in 1287 was not stronger in raw manpower than it had been in 1241, but it was wiser. It had institutional memory. It had built specifically against Mongol methods. The invaders arrived expecting repetition. They encountered evolution. And while this was happening in Poland, the broader Mongol world was shifting too. The Ilkhanate was clashing with the Mamluks in the Middle East and suffering defeats. The Yuan dynasty in China was facing administrative strain and internal resistance. The myth of permanent Mongol momentum was beginning to fray at the edges. The failure in Poland was not the end of Mongol power, but it was a sign that the era of effortless expansion was over. Empires often reach a point where expansion becomes harder than consolidation. Logistics stretch thin. Political rivalries grow sharper. Enemies grow smarter. And that is exactly what 1287 represents. Now imagine being a Polish villager who had grown up hearing stories of Legnica, of Duke Henry II falling, of Mongol heads displayed on spears, of cities burning in days. Imagine living through 1241 as a child, watching smoke blot out the sky. Then imagine hearing, in January 1288, that the Mongols were retreating, not because they chose to, because they were defeated. That psychological reversal is monumental, but it's the moment a nightmare loses its supernatural aura. The Mongols were no longer apocalyptic horsemen beyond human resistance. They were armies, dangerous, powerful, but beatable. And once something is proven beatable, everything changes. This is the turning point where Poland's identity begins hardening around resilience rather than victimhood, where defense becomes national strategy, where unity becomes political necessity. And we're not done yet, because what happened after 1288 inside the Golden Horde, especially the rivalry between Nogai and Talabuga, would further destabilize Mongol power. And what happened inside Poland politically would slowly push the fragmented duchies toward reunification. The battlefields may have quieted, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The smoke of battle had long since thinned, but its memory lingered like a scar across the land. Caitlin did not chase glory. He chased stability in the weeks following his victory. He turned his attention not to conquest, but to control. Garrisons were established along the northern passes. Supply lines were fortified. Messengers rode day and night, not with threats, but with carefully worded promises. Amnesty for those who bent the knee. Trade privileges for towns that pledged loyalty. Swift retribution for those who whispered rebellion. He understood something many warlords never did. Victory on the field is loud. Victory over men's minds is silent. And silence lasts longer. Yet even as the North settled into uneasy submission, rumors drifted from beyond the western seas. Traders spoke of a rising power, an empire built not on banners and bloodlines, but on ships and silver. Its rulers did not demand tribute through siege. They demanded contracts, ports, influence. Caitlin listened, thought he had seen this pattern before in history. The same quiet expansion that once allowed Rome to swallow kingdoms without firing a single arrow. The same calculated patience that let distant dynasties dominate trade routes and reshape continents without ever declaring formal war. He would not underestimate while his armies rested. He began something more dangerous than preparation for battle. He began preparation for transformation. Engineers were summoned from the south. Scholars from rival courts were invited under guarded hospitality. Smiths were tasked not with forging swords, but with refining steel in new ways. Shipwrights studied foreign hull designs copied from merchant vessels docked in secret harbors and in private chambers. Caitlin spoke to his most trusted advisors about something radical. What if our strength no longer depends on land alone? It was a question that would echo across decades, because while the plains of the north had tested his endurance, the coming conflict would test his imagination. Meanwhile, beyond his borders, another figure watched with equal calculation. A prince exiled from his homeland, a strategist who had lost everything in a civil war sparked by betrayal. He had survived not through strength, but through patience. He had heard of Caitlin, and unlike the northern warlords, he did not fear him, but he studied him. The stage was shifting from brute conquest to strategic dominance, from open fields to shadow diplomacy, from clashing steel to economic strangulation. Empires do not fall in a day. They erode. Caitlin sensed it. The North had been a test of survival. The West would be a test of adaptation. And somewhere in the East, beyond mountains still unmapped, forces were stirring that would one day drag this fragile balance into chaos once more. But that is a story still forming. For now, Caitlin stood upon the ramparts at dusk, watching the horizon where sea met sky, not as a conqueror, but as a ruler who understood that history does not reward the strongest. It rewards the ones who evolve. And evolution, unlike war, never truly ends. The Council of Doubt, the Great Hall, was colder than usual that evening. Torches flickered against iron-bound pillars as Caitlin laid out his vision before the High Council. "We expand west," he said, voice steady. "Not with legions, with fleets." The chamber erupted. Generals who had bled in the northern campaign pounded their fists in protest. Admirals, few and largely ceremonial, shifted uncomfortably. Treasury officials whispered about costs. Grain overseers worried about losing laborers to shipyards. "You built this realm on land," one old commander barked. "On iron and discipline. Ships are for traders and pirates." Caitlin let the uproar run its course. Then he did something unexpected. He unrolled a map. Not of borders, not of battlefields, but of trade routes. Thin red lines traced the western currents. Silver markers denoted ports controlled by the rising maritime power, a coalition of merchant princes whose influence stretched farther than their flags. "They already surround us," Caitlin said quietly. Silence fell. "They do not need to conquer our fields. They can choke them. Salt prices will rise. Timber will disappear. Foreign steel will outmatch ours. We will wake one morning sovereign in name and dependent in reality." It was the first time many in that chamber realized the war had already begun. The shipyards of renewal construction started at once. Entire districts were cleared along the southern coast. Oak forests were marked for controlled harvest. Ironworks shifted from spearheads to rivets. Tar, rope, canvas, commodities once secondary, became strategic resources. The first hull laid down was christened the Resolute. It was not the largest vessel in the harbor, not the most ornate, but it represented something new, a warship built with trade in mind. Its lower decks housed cargo space designed for negotiation leverage. Its upper decks held reinforced ballista mounts, subtle reminders that diplomacy travels safer with teeth. Shipwrights experimented with hybrid designs learned from foreign merchants. Broader keels for stability in rough western swells, reinforced rudders for long voyages, modular rigging for quick repairs at sea. Caitlin visited the docks personally. He spoke not only to captains, but to carpenters. Not only to admirals, but to rope makers. He asked questions about tension, weight distribution, seasonal winds, and slowly, something changed in him. He began thinking like the sea. Fluid, adaptive, relentless. The exiled prince far to the southwest, in a port city thick with salt and ambition. The exiled prince received confirmation of Caitlin's projects. His name was Darien. Once heir to a throne that no longer existed, he had learned survival in exile. He had bartered jewels for passage, sold ancestral heirlooms to fund mercenaries, watched supposed allies abandon him when coin ran thin. But he had also learned something far more dangerous. Power follows movement, and nothing moves like ships. Darien studied reports of Catelyn's fleet construction with fascination. He is not reacting, Darien murmured to his advisor. He is anticipating. Unlike the northern lords who underestimated Catelyn's patience, Darien saw a kindred strategist, and he made a decision he would not oppose Catelyn, but he would join him. Not publicly, not yet, but through intermediaries, letters began to travel. Offers of navigational charts, proposals for shared port access, quiet intelligence on the merchant coalition tightening its grip on western waters, a partnership forged not by trust, but by mutual threat. The merchant coalition, the Western maritime power, was no empire in the traditional sense. It had no single emperor, no unified banner. It was a web. Merchant families controlled fleets. Banking houses financed expeditions. Port governors answered not to kings, but to contracts, and contracts, unlike oaths, are unforgiving. When news of Catelyn's expanding navy reached their councils, reactions varied. Some dismissed it as posturing. Others saw danger. He controls inland production, one merchant lord warned. If he reaches the sea fully armed, he can dictate timber exports, grain shipments, and iron trade. And if we restrict him first, another suggested, sanctions began quietly. Cargo inspections intensified. Insurance rates for ships docking in Catelyn's ports mysteriously doubled. A shipment of critical sailcloth was delayed indefinitely under bureaucratic pretense. It was not war. It was suffocation. Catelyn expected it. He had planned for it. The eastern murmur while westward tensions simmered. Reports trickled in from beyond the eastern mountain ranges. Nomadic confederations were uniting under a single banner. Caravans spoke of a leader who combined spiritual authority with ruthless discipline. Entire tribes once divided by blood feuds now marched together. Catelyn did not panic, but he calculated if the East consolidated and the West tightened trade, his realm could be pressed from two sides, one economic, one militaristic. The solution was not simply more soldiers or more ships, that it was cohesion, that he initiated administrative reforms that bound distant provinces tighter to the capital. Standardized taxation, centralized command structures, codified trade laws. These measures were unpopular, but empires that hesitate to reform die, defending traditions that no longer serve them. Catelyn chose discomfort over decline that a new doctrine months turned into years. The fleet grew. Trade began to stabilize under Catelyn's controlled tariffs. Select merchant houses were granted exclusive privileges in exchange for loyalty. Rivals were quietly undercut through state-backed ventures. The coalition's web encountered resistance. And for the first time, they realized Catelyn was not merely protecting his sovereignty, he was entering their game. Not as a participant, as a competitor. The first joint expedition between Catelyn's fleet and Darien's covert allies sailed west under neutral colors. Officially a trade mission, unofficially a probe, testing how far the coalition would push back. When one of the ships was accidentally rammed in contested waters, Catelyn did not retaliate immediately that he sent a letter. Calm. Direct. Strategic. If you wish for open conflict, it read, state it plainly. If not, adjust your behavior accordingly. The response came weeks later. Measured. Careful. They were no longer certain of dominance. The turning point approaches Catelyn stood once more upon the ramparts, but now the harbor below was filled with masts. Dozens of them. Sails furled like sleeping giants awaiting command. He had not abandoned the land, he had expanded beyond it. Yet he understood something few rulers ever admit. Every adaptation invites escalation. The East would not remain quiet forever. The merchant coalition would not surrender profits willingly, and alliances built on mutual interest can fracture under strain. But for now, balance held that a fragile equilibrium between steel, silver, and strategy. Catelyn had survived the battlefield he had mastered. Consolidation. Now he was entering the most dangerous phase of all. Competition between equals. And when equals clash, history does not produce skirmishes that it produces eras. The first sign that balance was breaking did not come from the west or the east, but from within. It began with a ship that failed to return. The Resolute's sister vessel, the Dawn Treader, had been dispatched along a contested trade corridor where merchant coalition patrols frequently inspected foreign hulls under legal pretense. Its mission had been simple: escort 3 grain transports, document any interference, and return with proof of harassment. Weeks passed without signal fires on the horizon, without messenger gulls, without debris washing ashore. Caitlin did not rage. He ordered information. Scouts traced the last known coordinates. Coastal villages reported distant smoke on the water 3 nights prior. A fisherman claimed he had seen a mast burning against the sunset, but had feared speaking of it. When fragments of charred hull finally drifted into harbor, they bore not the marks of accidental collision, but deliberate breaching. Ballista punctures, fiery pods. It was a message. The merchant coalition, confident in its legal language and fragmented authority, assumed Caitlin would respond with formal protest. They expected delay, committees, debate. Instead, Caitlin summoned Darien. The exiled prince arrived under discreet escort, cloaked not in royal insignia, but in anonymity. Years in foreign ports had sharpened him. He no longer carried himself as a dispossessed heir, but as a man who had studied power in its rawest form. They test whether you will act, Darien said after reviewing the reports. If you hesitate, they will tighten the cord. If you strike blindly, they will call you aggressor and unite against you. Caitlin walked the length of the strategy chamber before answering. Then we do neither. Within days, a new directive spread through the fleet. Warships would not escort cargo openly. Instead, trade vessels would sail lightly armed, appearing vulnerable. At a calculated distance beyond visible range, Caitlin's fastest frigates would shadow them under neutral colors. Any attack would be met not with protest, but with immediate interception. The trap was patient that it did not take long. 2 coalition patrol ships approached a timber convoy near the Gray Shoals, citing inspection rights. When the lead cargo vessel slowed, grappling lines were thrown. Coalition Marines boarded with rehearsed authority. They never saw the frigates emerging from morning fog, sails angled for speed, ballista crews already loaded. The engagement was swift and clinical. One patrol ship surrendered after its rudder was shattered. The other attempted escape and was disabled without being sunk. Survivors were treated, documented, and returned with copies of a written statement signed by Caitlin's seal. Trade will not be hindered. Further interference will be interpreted as piracy. It was not war. Not officially, but the coalition's insurance houses reacted immediately. Rates for patrol operations in Caitlin's water spiked. Merchant captains began quietly avoiding confrontations. Profits dipped. Across the sea, in the marble chambers of the coalition's financial council, arguments erupted. Some demanded escalation, others restraint. Their strength had always been unity of interest, not unity of command. Now that unity was cracking. Yet as pressure eased in the west, the east began to move. Caravan routes that once flowed steadily toward Caitlin's markets thinned. Traders reported new levies imposed by the rising Eastern Confederation. Entire border villages sent pleas describing mounted scouts appearing at dusk, not raiding, not threatening, merely observing. Their leader, known only by a title that translated loosely to Voice of the Sky, had accomplished what generations before him could not. He had bound rival tribes with a doctrine that blended prophecy and discipline. Those who joined retained autonomy, but contributed warriors and tribute. Those who refused found themselves isolated, cut off from grazing lands and trade paths. Caitlin understood the pattern. Consolidation, centralization, the same path he had walked. Unlike the merchant coalition, the Eastern Confederation did not hide behind contracts. It moved with clarity. Darien saw opportunity. If they expand westward, they collide with your borders. If they expand north, they collide with your rivals. Either way, conflict benefits you. Caitlin disagreed. Uncontrolled conflict destabilizes markets and fractures loyalty. I do not want neighbors at war. I want neighbors calculating. So instead of mobilizing legions, he sent envoys east carrying gifts not of gold, but of utility. Steel plowheads, engineered saddle designs, proposals for shared caravan security. Months passed before a response came that it was not a letter, that it was a delegation. Riders entered Catelyn's capital without spectacle, bearing neither threat nor submission. At their center rode a man, neither young nor old, eyes steady, posture composed. The voice of the sky did not bow. Neither did Catelyn. Their meeting lasted hours behind closed doors. Observers speculated endlessly, but no record was released. What is known is that afterward, border skirmishes ceased. Caravan traffic resumed under joint patrol agreements. A corridor of mutual interest was established across contested plains. Point two expanding powers had chosen alignment over annihilation. The merchant coalition watched this development with alarm. A land empire mastering the sea was concerning. A land empire securing its eastern frontier was dangerous. Inside Catelyn's own court, murmurs began. Some generals resented the restraint. They had trained for conquest, not equilibrium. Certain nobles whispered that trade concessions favored coastal cities over inland estates. Treasury reforms that had funded the fleet now limited aristocratic exemptions. Darien, ever observant, noticed the tension first. Your external enemies test your strength. Your internal allies test your patience. Catelyn did not dismiss the warning that he began rotating provincial commanders more frequently, preventing any single region from becoming a power base. He expanded merit-based promotions within the fleet and army, quietly reducing the influence of hereditary privilege. He commissioned public works in neglected inland territories, ensuring prosperity did not appear coastal-centric. But reforms create winners and losers. And losers conspire. Point one winter night. Intercepted correspondence revealed a faction of nobles negotiating discreetly with coalition intermediaries. Not treason in the dramatic sense. No assassinationplats. Simply in agreement. In exchange for favorable trade monopolies and restoration of tax privileges, they would pressure Catelyn to reduce naval expansion and loosen central oversight. Economic sabotage disguised as political dissent. Catelyn faced a choice that defined rulers more than battles ever could. Purge them and risk martyrdom. Expose them and risk instability, or outmaneuver them. He chose the third, that a public audit was announced under the guise of administrative transparency. Irregularities in provincial ledgers were revealed, not through accusation, but documentation. The implicated nobles were not imprisoned. They were reassigned to distant administrative posts stripped of regional influence, but retaining nominal honor. That it was bloodless and devastating. The message was clear. Resistance would not be crushed loudly. It would be absorbed and neutralized. As spring thawed the rivers and trade resumed at full volume. Catelyn's realm stood stronger than it had at any point in its history. The West hesitated. The East cooperated. Internal dissent was contained, yet stability has a peculiar effect on ambitious men. Darien, once ally of necessity, had begun cultivating loyalty within the fleet. Captains respected his maritime expertise. Sailors admired his exile-forged resilience. He never contradicted Catelyn publicly, but his influence grew quietly. Catelyn noticed that he did not confront him, but he waited, because he knew something Darien did not. Balance is not permanent. It is transitional. And somewhere beyond the mapped seas, beyond the steppe horizon, forces were accumulating that neither trade agreements nor calculated restraint would contain. The era of maneuvering was nearing its limit. The era of reckoning was approaching. And when it arrived, it would test not just Catelyn's strategy, but his succession, his alliances, and the very structure he had built so carefully. The story is widening, not narrowing. The summer the storms came, they did not come from the sky. They came from men who had grown too powerful in calm waters. Trade was thriving. The eastern corridor was secure. Coalition patrols had grown cautious. For the first time in years, the harbors were loud with commerce instead of tension. Shipwrights repaired instead of rushed. Soldiers trained instead of marched. Peace, even strategic peace, creates space, and space allows ambition to breathe. Darien had become indispensable. He oversaw fleet logistics with precision, reorganized signal systems across long-distance routes, and introduced convoy rotations that reduced vulnerability. Sailors spoke his name with admiration. Younger officers sought his mentorship. He never claimed authority, yet authority gathered around him. Caitlin observed without interference. He had always believed in cultivating capable men. But he also understood a rule history repeats without mercy. Capable men who command loyalty eventually test boundaries. The test came disguised as opportunity that a distant archipelago, long ignored due to pirate activity and unstable currents, sent envoys requesting protection in exchange for exclusive port rights. The islands sat at a strategic midpoint between coalition waters and emerging western routes. Control of them would extend Caitlin's reach dramatically. Darien argued for immediate acceptance and rapid deployment. "We secure the islands," he said in council, "and we dominate the western approach. The coalition will have to negotiate on our terms." Several admirals agreed. Expansion felt natural, almost inevitable. Caitlin asked only one question. And if the request itself is bait? Silence lingered. Intelligence reports were incomplete. Pirate activity had suspiciously declined in recent months. Coalition merchant ships have been sighted near the archipelago more frequently than usual. Darien pressed the advantage. "If we hesitate, they will move first." Caitlin delayed the decision. That hesitation altered everything. 3 weeks later, before Caitlin committed forces, a coalition-backed fleet sailed openly to the archipelago, signing protection agreements and establishing fortified trade stations. They moved with speed and coordination rarely seen among their fragmented houses. The message was unmistakable. They had anticipated the hesitation. Within Caitlin's court, criticism surfaced carefully but audibly. Some argued the opportunity had been lost. Others questioned whether excessive caution was now costing influence. Darien did not openly challenge Caitlin, but he did not defend him either. Instead, he proposed a limited demonstration, a naval exercise near the contested waters, framed as routine maneuvering but designed to pressure coalition presence. It was bold without being technically aggressive. Caitlin approved. The fleet assembled with disciplined precision. Warships moved in coordinated formations, sails aligned like blades in motion. Coalition observers responded by reinforcing their island garrisons. The sea became a chessboard, each side testing reaction times. Then something neither side expected happened: that a storm system, violent and unpredictable, tore through the contested waters during the height of the maneuver. 3 coalition vessels were wrecked against reefs. 2 of Caitlin's ships were driven off course, one vanishing entirely. Nature had intervened. Caitlin immediately dispatched rescue operations, not only for his own crews, but for coalition survivors as well. It was a calculated gesture, but a sincere one. Lives saved at sea carry weight beyond politics. Darien disagreed with the scope of the rescue. "They would not do the same for us," he warned. "Then we prove we are not them," Caitlin replied. Coalition captains, hauled from wreckage by Caitlin's sailors, returned home carrying stories that complicated the narrative of rivalry. Insurance losses mounted. Public sentiment in coastal cities shifted subtly. Merchants began questioning whether perpetual escalation was worth the risk. Yet the storm had consequences beyond damaged hulls. One of the missing ships, the one that vanished, resurfaced weeks later in an eastern harbor under Confederation escort. It had not been destroyed. It had drifted deep into eastern waters and been recovered by riders loyal to the voice of the sky. The eastern leader sent it back fully repaired, along with a message: the sea does not belong to one banner, nor does the horizon. Caitlin understood the layered meaning. The East was watching Western tensions carefully. A destabilized West could push coalition expansion toward Eastern trade routes. Their cooperation with Caitlin was strategic, not sentimental. The balance was no longer bilateral, the IT was triangular, and triangles are inherently unstable. Meanwhile, internal whispers intensified. Some nobles framed Catelyn's restraint as weakness. Others quietly favored Darienne's assertiveness. Nothing overt, nothing actionable, but influence was shifting like sand beneath stone. Catelyn made a move few anticipated. He announced the formation of a maritime council composed not only of nobles and admirals, but elected representatives from major port cities, merchant guilds, and inland trade caravans. Strategic decisions regarding expansion would now require broader consultation. Power dispersed slightly, but it strengthened legitimacy, and it complicated any attempt at concentrated dissent. Darienne supported the reform publicly. Privately, he began cultivating relationships within the new council structure, positioning himself as the bridge between military ambition and commercial interests. He was not plotting open betrayal. He was positioning for inevitability, because beneath all diplomacy, beneath storms and rescues and shifting alliances, one reality was emerging with increasing clarity. Catelyn had built a system. Darienne was building influence within it, and systems outlive founders. The next fracture would not be about islands or patrol routes. That it would be about succession, legacy, and who commands the future when equilibrium finally collapses. The sea had grown quiet again, but it was the quiet of pressure building beneath the surface, not peace. The breaking point did not arrive with a declaration of war, but with a signature. One of the largest merchant houses within the coalition consolidated 3 rival families under a single maritime charter, effectively centralizing command over nearly half of the Western patrol fleets. What had once been a loose web was becoming a spine. Insurance firms aligned under unified rates. Escort vessels began sailing in disciplined squadrons instead of scattered patrols. For the first time, the coalition resembled an empire in everything but name. Catelyn understood immediately what that meant. Fragmented interests could be pressured. Unified interests required confrontation. Within months, coalition squadrons began escorting convoys aggressively through contested waters, ignoring Catelyn's prior warnings. They did not board ships. They did not fire. They simply occupied space in numbers large enough to intimidate. Trade slowed again. Darienne called it what it was. They are testing dominance. If we yield these waters symbolically, we yield them practically. Catelyn convened the Maritime Council. Arguments split cleanly down philosophy. The merchant representatives urged caution. Open naval battle would spike costs and risk embargo. Admirals demanded strength. Hesitation would erode credibility. Inland delegates worried about grain exports piling up in warehouses. For the first time, Catelyn felt the weight of shared governance pressing against decisive action. He had built this council to prevent instability, yet now it slowed reaction time. Darienne stepped forward with a proposal more aggressive than any before. "We do not attack their convoys," he said. "We isolate their flagship squadron. One decisive engagement. Not piracy, not skirmish. A demonstration of naval superiority so clear that negotiation becomes their only rational option." The room tightened around the idea. Catelyn did not reject it outright. Instead, he asked for preparation timelines, wind forecasts, supply projections. If battle came, it would not be emotional. It would be calculated. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. A coalition flagship squadron, led by a newly appointed High Commodore eager to assert dominance, anchored near the Grey Shoals, the same waters where earlier tensions had simmered. They declared the area under temporary stabilization authority, citing increased piracy reports that it was a legal fiction. Catelyn responded by mobilizing half his fleet under Darienne's tactical command, while retaining strategic oversight himself. The arrangement was deliberate. Darienne would execute. Catelyn would authorize. The fleets sighted each other at dawn beneath low cloud cover. Sails cut through gray light. Signal flags snapped in sharp wind. No side fired immediately. Hours passed in maneuver. Darienne ordered a crescent formation, designed to pressure the coalition squadron toward the reefs without appearing to encircle. Coalition ships adjusted defensively, tightening their line. Tension stretched like drawn wire. Then a single miscalculation. or perhaps an intentional gamble, changed everything. A coalition escort ship advanced aggressively to disrupt Catelyn's flank. Darien responded instantly with a flanking acceleration maneuver that brought ballista range into play. The first volley split the morning AI, or .it, was not chaotic. It was precise. Rudders targeted, sails shredded, masts cracked rather than hulls sunk. Darien had trained for disablement, not slaughter. Coalition return fire struck hard, but lacked cohesion. Their centralized command structure, newly formed, faltered under real combat pressure. Orders overlapped. Signals conflicted. Within 2 hours, 3 coalition vessels were immobilized and the flagship's mast collapsed under concentrated fire. Darien could have ordered boarding and capture, but he did not. Instead, he signaled withdrawal once superiority was undeniable. The message was unmistakable. We can destroy you. We choose restraint. The aftermath rippled across every coastal city. Coalition markets reeled. Their newly unified command faced internal blame. Some merchant houses accused others of provoking escalation too quickly. Insurance premiums soared again. Catelyn's ports surged with renewed traffic. It was, tactically, a triumph. Strategically, it deepened the divide at home. Admirals praised Darien openly. Sailors celebrated him in taverns. Even council members who had argued caution admitted the outcome strengthened negotiation leverage. Catelyn congratulated Darien publicly. Privately, he studied the implications. Darien had commanded flawlessly. He had earned loyalty through competence and restraint. His name now carried weight not just among sailors, but among merchants who saw profits secured by strength, and Catelyn had allowed it. Not by weakness, by design. Yet design does not prevent consequence. Whispers shifted tone within the court. Not treason, not conspiracy, but speculation that if Catelyn were to fall in battle, who commands the fleet? If the realm transitions, who holds maritime loyalty? If expansion continues, who becomes the face of it? Succession had never been openly debated. Catelyn's heirs were young and untested. The realm had grown accustomed to his presence as constant gravity. Darien, meanwhile, had become the axis of the Navy. The Eastern Confederation observed the naval clash carefully. The voice of the sky sent a measured communique acknowledging Catelyn's measured strength. It was praise, but also a reminder. Stability depended on continuity. Catelyn understood the deeper truth forming beneath events. The external balance had shifted in his favor. The internal balance had shifted toward Darien. History rarely allows both to remain stable simultaneously. As negotiations reopened with the shaken coalition, Catelyn began quietly accelerating one final project. The formal codification of succession law and unified military command hierarchy under civilian oversight. It was administrative on the surface, revolutionary in implication. Because if the realm was to survive beyond him, power could not depend on personal loyalty alone. Darien sensed the shift, but did not oppose it. Not yet. The sea was calm again. But now 2 commanders stood at its edge, respected, capable, and aware that the next conflict might not come from beyond the horizon. It might come from the question of who defines it. The calm on the western waters was deceptive. While Darien's fleet had demonstrated strength, whispers of discontent and rivalry festered beneath the polished decks and quiet councils. Catelyn had always known that governance, like the sea, required constant attention. Still, the speed at which influence shifted surprised even him. One misstep, one overlooked grievance, and a loyal officer could find himself at odds with the very system he served. Darien did not misstep. Every public action was precise. Every maneuver calculated to consolidate credibility without crossing the line of overt ambition. Sailors and merchants alike spoke of his judgment as if it were natural law. And yet, the subtlety of power accumulation is rarely visible to the observer. It is almost always visible to the one holding it. Catelyn noticed. He could see how quickly Darien had become the axis around which loyalty pivoted. Then came the news from the east. A coalition of riverine states, long neutral but increasingly restless, had mobilized forces along the border of the Varelia Passage, threatening to blockade eastern trade routes and potentially disrupt centuries-old agreements. Their claim was simple. Western fleets had been encroaching too close, their patrols too frequent, their influence too pervasive. The threat, while nominally political, carried the weight of economic warfare. Grain shipments, critical supplies, and merchant caravans could be delayed indefinitely if left unchecked. Caitlin convened the council, but this time the room was different. Voices that had once deferred now challenged openly. Some merchants pressed for negotiation, fearing the cost of conflict. Admirals favored decisive military engagement, emphasizing speed and surprise. Darien, as always, spoke measuredly, balancing ambition with practicality. "We cannot let eastern states dictate access to critical passages," he said. "A swift, visible presence will reinforce our sovereignty without committing to prolonged battle." Caitlin considered the proposal carefully. His mind moved across maps, currents, and seasonal weather, calculating how fleets, supplies, and alliances would respond. Then he noticed another layer: political signaling. Deploying a force rapidly to the Varelia Passage would demonstrate decisiveness, but also elevate Darien's visibility further. The very officer entrusted with execution would be seen as the guardian of Eastern stability, the architect of success that he made the decision. "Prepare a rapid deploiement," Caitlin commanded. "Darien will lead. I will oversee from the central port, coordinating supply and intelligence." The fleet moved with precision, the kind of disciplined coordination Caitlin had cultivated for decades. Darien's ships cut across currents and tides, arriving at the Varelia Passage before the Eastern Coalition could complete fortifications. Signal flags and patrol formations communicated presence without provocation. They did not engage. They demonstrated control that IT worked. Eastern forces hesitated, their blockade incomplete, and behind their leaders' hesitation grew doubt. Darien's presence was enough to prevent immediate escalation, though it did not eliminate the underlying tension. News returned quickly. Merchants and minor nobles in eastern cities were already appealing for negotiation rather than confrontation. Yet Caitlin knew the real danger was not the East. It was what the East revealed. The ease with which Darien's competence and reputation could eclipse the authority of the council itself, and even his own. Officers who had once deferred began seeking counsel from Darien first. Messages from allied states asked specifically for his guidance. Every act intended to strengthen the realm also strengthened Darien's individual presence. That night, Caitlin walked the central quay alone. The sea stretched black and still, broken only by the lanterns reflecting off the water. Ships rocked gently. Waves lapped like measured breathing. Caitlin thought of history, of leaders who had held too tightly and those who had let influence drift away unnoticed. The lesson was simple. No one survives succession unchallenged, no matter how competent or beloved. Darien returned later, reporting minor skirmishes with pirates and the Eastern Observation Fleet. He spoke of successes, but also of ongoing intelligence gathering, maps of currents, trade movements, and shifting loyalties. His words were thorough, precise, unflinching, but there was an undertone Caitlin could not ignore. Confidence had hardened into expectation, and with expectation comes impatience. The following week, the council met again, this time to discuss policy toward neutral maritime states and the distribution of trade privileges. Darien advocated for a more assertive stance, pressing for privileges that would benefit his fleets directly. Caitlin countered subtly, reminding the council of long-term stability and the importance of shared prosperity. The room hung on each word. Not one council member spoke without calculating consequence. Weighing loyalty, ambition, and gain to be why the end of the meeting, nothing had changed on paper. The policy was agreed, neutral states remained balanced, trade routes partially regulated. But the invisible lines had shifted. The perception of power, the recognition of who could deliver results when authority faltered, had moved. Caitlin understood the truth now, as he often did before others could see it. External threats sharpened internal dynamics. By neutralizing the Eastern challenge without bloodshed, he had averted a crisis, yes. But in doing so, he had revealed the capabilities and reach of the man he had nurtured, the man who now stood, quietly, at the center of every operational success. And as he watched the sun rise over calm waters, he realized that the next battle, the one that would test loyalty, ambition, and strategy simultaneously, would not be fought at sea. It would be fought within the very court and council he had created, under the watchful eyes of those who measured power and influence rather than command. The horizon had never seemed so empty, and yet so threatening. The council chambers had never been so quiet. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that danced across polished floors. Outside, the harbor was alive with the steady rhythm of oars and sails, but inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Today, Caitlin would speak directly about authority, and Darien would respond. Neither could avoid the unspoken truth. The growing respect and reliance on Darien's judgment had begun to shift the balance of power, and both men knew it. Caitlin opened the session with deliberate calm, reciting trade reports, patrol results, and recent deployments. His tone was precise, his eyes scanning for reactions. He did not accuse. He did not praise. He simply stated facts. Yet the weight behind those facts was unmistakable. He was reminding the council, and Darien, that the responsibility for the realm's stability ultimately rested with him. Darien listened without interruption. When Caitlin paused, Darien rose. His voice was measured, even carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, yet tempered by respect. "We have seen success in recent weeks," he said. "Convoys escorted, borders observed, neutral threats managed. But the methods we employed, fleet deployments, rapid maneuvers, and decisive engagement, require trust in those who act on the water. We cannot allow hesitation or bureaucratic delays to hinder what must be done." A murmur passed through the room. Some council members nodded. Some frowned. Caitlin's eyes never left Darien. There was a sharpness there, subtle but unmistakable. "You speak as if authority belongs to the one who executes," Caitlin said quietly. "But authority is earned in thought as well as action. Strategy is not simply following the tide. It is shaping it. Decisions made without foresight risk more than ships. They risk the realm." Darien's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He knew the line Caitlin was drawing. He also knew that the council's perception had shifted. Every merchant representative, every admiral, every inland delegate had seen the fleet succeed under his command. Every victory, every obstacle navigated, reinforced his standing. And yet, Darien replied, "Success is measured in outcome, not in hesitation." The Eastern threat was neutralized, the coalition humbled, and trade flows restored. If prudence had slowed our hand, all three might have faltered. Execution matters. The words hung in the air. A single syllable of confrontation, yet the implications were profound. Caitlin could have rebuked him openly. He could have reminded the council of the chain of command, of the years of experience that no single victory could outweigh. Instead, he leaned back slightly, letting silence speak, forcing everyone in the chamber to fill the space with their own assumptions. For the first time, the conversation was no longer about strategy. It was about influence, ambition, and succession. Who would lead if the realm faced a true crisis? Who would be trusted when lives, livelihoods, and the very stability of governance hung in the balance? Darien, perceptive as always, did not press further. He knew the moment to challenge would come later, when action, not words, would settle the matter. For now, he maintained deference, even as he demonstrated competence. Caitlin, meanwhile, began quietly considering contingencies. His mind ran across fleets, supply lines, inland militias, and diplomatic alliances. He recognized that the strength of the realm no longer rested solely on his decisions. The margin for error had narrowed, and yet he also saw the opportunity. If managed carefully, Darien could be both a powerful lieutenant and a stabilizing force for the next generation, without threatening the integrity of governance. Even as the council dispersed, tension lingered. The corridors echoed with hushed conversations, council members debating quietly among themselves. Some marveled at Darien's abilities. Some speculated on how far his ambition might stretch. A few whispered about Caitlyn's prudence, or perhaps hesitance, in acknowledging the shifting tides of loyalty and influence. Outside the chamber, the harbor remained a mirror of calm. The fleet waited silently, ready to respond to any signal. Yet within the walls of governance, a far more delicate maneuvering was underway. The negotiation of authority, the balance of respect, and the subtle contest of wills that would define not just strategy, but succession, trust, and ultimately, the survival of the realm. As night fell, Caitlyn returned to his private study. Maps were spread across the table, reports stacked neatly. He did not write orders. He considered consequences. Every deployment, every engagement, every conversation now carried multiple layers of implication. The realm depended on more than speed or skill. It depended on the alignment of loyalty, ambition, and foresight. Darien, too, reflected. Not on obedience, not on praise, but on potential. He understood the limitations imposed by hierarchy, yet he recognized where influence might quietly tip the scales. The next engagement, whether on the sea, in trade, or within council walls, would test more than ships or soldiers. It would test trust, cunning, and the subtle calculus of power. And far to the east, beyond observation, forces stirred quietly. Minor states had noted the fleet's maneuvers, the discipline, and the decisive management of the coalition. Rumors of unrest and opportunity began to circulate. Caitlyn and Darien were aware of none of these rumors yet, but they would soon collide with the realm's internal dynamics, forcing both men to navigate threats that were not merely tactical, but political and personal as well. The stage was set. The currents of ambition, loyalty, and strategy began to converge. The next chapter, Caitlyn knew, would demand decisions that no map, fleet, or council vote could fully prepare them for. Spring winds carried whispers of unrest from the eastern border. A coalition of minor riverine states, emboldened by the perception of opportunity, had begun to mobilize, seeking to challenge control over the trade passages that Darien had so recently secured. Their forces were smaller than the combined fleets of Caitlyn's domain, but they were quick, adaptable, and willing to exploit any hesitation. For Caitlyn, hesitation was a luxury he could no longer afford. He called a council on short notice. Darien arrived first. As usual, his bearing calm, confident, and prepared. Others trickled in, admirals, magistrates, and envoys from allied cities. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone had heard the reports, yet the details remained fragmented, open to interpretation and rumor. Caitlyn opened with an outline of intelligence, reports of raiding parties, intercepted letters suggesting a coordinated effort, and signs that some eastern states were prepared to blockade key trade points. Darien listened, then spoke. Our approach must be twofold. First, a visible presence along the eastern passages to dissuade any isolated action. Second, we gather intelligence on the coalition's coordination. We strike only when we can guarantee decisive effect, not reactionary measures. Caitlyn nodded, though inwardly he noted the subtle tension his subordinates' plan introduced. It was efficient and effective, but every decision placed more visibility and prestige into Darien's hands. Every decisive strike by Darien would elevate him further, leaving Caitlyn in the role of observer, strategist, and silent evaluator. Orders were dispatched immediately. Fleets moved into position, their sails catching the early spring currents with precision. Scouts were sent upriver to monitor troop movements, report back on supply lines, and uncover potential weaknesses. The Eastern Coalition, however, was not entirely predictable. Intelligence revealed conflicting signals. Some states were ready to negotiate, others were preparing for confrontation, and one minor kingdom appeared to be secretly rallying additional troops from beyond the mountains, unseen and unaccounted for. By mid-morning, the first engagement occurred. A small eastern raiding party attempted to seize a key trading post along the Varelia Passage. Darien moved swiftly, his ships cutting across the current, intercepting the raiders before they could establish foothold. His execution was flawless. The raiders were repelled with minimal damage to the trade post, and the local defenders were emboldened by the presence of his fleet. Reports reached Caitlin immediately. The council murmured at the efficiency and boldness of the action. Yet, success bred scrutiny. Caitlin observed the movements of the fleet from the central port, noting that Darien's visibility was now absolute. Every victory, every patrol, and every decisive maneuver further cemented his influence in the minds of the council and the population alike. Caitlin knew this was necessary. Swift action prevented escalation and maintained stability. But he also recognized the subtle danger. Unchecked, Darien's rising authority could challenge the traditional command structure, and even Caitlin's oversight. Over the following days, skirmishes continued. Raiding parties were intercepted, supply convoys secured, and minor blockades dismantled. Darien's strategy relied not on outright annihilation, but on rapid, precise deterrence. The Eastern Coalition learned quickly that aggression would be met with overwhelming response. Yet Caitlin noted the coalition's adaptability. They were learning, adjusting, and probing weaknesses, testing coordination between fleets, timing of supply deliveries, and the limits of local loyalty. One night, Caitlin convened a private session with Darien. The corridors were empty, the harbor quiet except for the soft lapping of water against hulls. "Your success is undeniable," Caitlin began. "But the more effective you are, the more visibility and influence you gain. The council is beginning to see you as the operational authority. That perception will have consequences if not managed." Darien inclined his head, understanding the warning. "I do not seek to overshadow you, Caitlin. My goal is stability and swift resolution. Yet, I cannot ignore openings when they present themselves." Caitlin studied him for a long moment, the interplay of ambition and loyalty apparent. "Remember this. Every action we take externally has a political impact internally. A victory here may become a question of authority there. You must be measured, even as you act decisively." Darien's response was calm, almost serene. "I will act with the realm's interests in mind. You will find no fault in my discretion." Yet Caitlin sensed the quiet tension beneath the surface. Competence combined with ambition can be as volatile as unchecked rebellion. The next morning brought another intelligence report. The Eastern Coalition had shifted tactics. Instead of isolated raids, they began moving larger groups to strategic points along the passages, attempting to consolidate forces before facing Caitlin's fleet. It was a direct challenge, testing response time, coordination, and the interplay of internal politics. Darien immediately proposed a combined maneuver, using both visible fleets and hidden patrols to cut off the advancing forces, forcing them into confined channels where their mobility would be negated. Caitlin approved, his mind calculating every variable. He knew the success of this operation would secure trade, assert dominance, and demonstrate deterrence. But he also understood it would further elevate Darien's authority in the eyes of allies, merchants, and even subordinates who now increasingly looked to Darien as the embodiment of action and decisiveness. As the fleets moved into position, the first real battle of coordination began. The Eastern Coalition's forces, confident in their numbers, attempted to blockade the narrow river channels. Darien's fleet, hidden by a combination of terrain and timing, emerged strategically, forcing the enemy into a trap. The engagement was swift, decisive, and largely bloodless. Ships were captured or dispersed, supply lines restored, and the raiders were forced to retreat. When the battle concluded, reports reached Caitlin. Another victory under Darien's command. Another boost to his reputation. And yet, Caitlin remained quietly aware of the delicate balance. External threats could be neutralized, but the internal contest of influence, loyalty, and authority was only just beginning. The horizon promised further challenges, both from the east and from within the walls of power, where every decision, every maneuver, every victory would be measured not just in strategic terms, but in the silent calculus of trust, ambition, and consequence. Spring had fully arrived, and with it, the Eastern coalition had regrouped. Intelligence reports now indicated that they were not merely raiding or testing boundaries. They were coordinating, moving larger forces along multiple river passages, attempting to create pressure points that could stretch Caitlyn's fleets thin. The realm's resources, once sufficient for localized threats, now faced the test of scale and complexity. Inside the council chambers, tension simmered. Some members advocated for immediate punitive expeditions into Eastern territory, arguing that only a show of force would deter further aggression. Others favored cautious containment, fearing overextension could leave critical ports vulnerable. Caitlyn listened to every argument, weighing the merits, but also observing the subtle undercurrents. Each counselor's opinion revealed ambition, fear, or alliance that might influence the realm's decision-making beyond the military outcome. Darien, however, was already thinking beyond rhetoric. Containment alone will allow them to regroup, he said calmly. Punitive strikes may overcommit our forces. The solution is precision, targeted engagements to disrupt their coordination combined with control over critical choke points. Force them to fight on our terms, not theirs. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who understood both strategy and the practical realities of execution. Caitlyn nodded, outwardly accepting the plan, but internally he was aware of the dual-edged nature of Darien's growing influence. Every successful operation strengthened Darien's standing among the fleet, the council, and even merchants who depended on the safe flow of goods. Caitlyn's own authority, though recognized, began to feel the subtle pressure of perception. He had trained, mentored, and trusted Darien, but the line between loyalty and rising power was narrowing. The following days saw the first coordinated engagements. The Eastern Coalition attempted simultaneous moves along two passages, hoping to overwhelm the realm's defenses. Darien, anticipating this, divided his forces with precision, using hidden patrols to channel the enemy into confined areas where maneuverability was limited and the fleet's superior discipline could dominate. The first encounter was swift. The Eastern raiders, confident in their numbers, attempted to seize control of the southern passage, only to find themselves trapped between Darien's forward ships and hidden flanking units. Resistance collapsed quickly, and several raiders surrendered. The second engagement was more challenging. The Eastern forces were larger, better coordinated, and determined to break through. For hours, the fleets clashed, navigation and timing becoming as critical as raw combat skill. Throughout the operation, Caitlyn observed from the central command port, issuing orders sparingly, allowing Darien's initiative to guide the tactical responses. Yet with each success, the tension within the council grew. Some whispered that Darien was effectively operating as the de facto commander. Others worried that Caitlyn's oversight might be intentionally permissive, setting the stage for a shift in authority one evening. After a long day of engagement, Caitlyn and Darien met privately at the harbor's edge. Lanterns reflected on the water, and the fleet rested in quiet readiness. Caitlyn spoke first. "You're acting with brilliance and efficiency, but the council is noticing. Your successes are not going unnoticed, and perception can be as powerful as victory." Darien's eyes met his. "I act for the realm's survival, not recognition. If perception grows alongside results, that is a consequence of necessity, not ambition." Caitlyn sighed. "Still, necessity is rarely neutral. You must understand the balance. Each victory strengthens your influence, but also reshapes expectations, both of the council and of your allies. How you handle that will determine the realm's stability, possibly as much as how you handle the enemy outside." The next day, reports indicated that the Eastern Coalition had adapted again. They were learning from previous failures, attempting to probe weaker points, sending envoys to neighboring territories for reinforcements, and testing the loyalty of minor ports along the passages. Darien proposed a series of rapid redeployments to anticipate and intercept these moves before they could consolidate. Caitlyn approved, recognizing both the operational necessity and the political reality. He could not ignore the enemy, and he could not restrain Darien, without risking both strategy and morale. The fleets moved with precision, engaging and dispersing scattered enemy units, intercepting supply lines, and securing key ports. The eastern forces began to fracture under sustained pressure, unable to coordinate large-scale movements. Yet, even as victory loomed over the Eastern Coalition, the internal political currents grew stronger. Council members debated Darien's authority. Merchants weighed the influence of successful protection on their loyalty, and Caitlin realized that future crises could test not just strategy, but the delicate balance of trust and power within his own realm. By the end of the week, the Eastern Coalition had been largely neutralized. Raiding parties were either captured, dispersed, or forced into retreat. Trade flows were restored, and the realm's borders secured. But the victories came with subtle consequences. Darien's reputation was higher than ever, and Caitlin's position, though still secure, required careful management of both perception and delegation. The stage was set for the next challenge, a coalition of external threats, emboldened by the initial perception of internal friction, would soon attempt to exploit divisions. Caitlin and Darien would have to act not just as commanders, but as negotiators of loyalty, influence, and authority. Every decision carried risk, both from the east and within the council itself. And the next engagement would test whether their cooperation could withstand pressure from all sides. Even as the eastern threat had been contained, whispers of a new coalition began filtering into Caitlin's intelligence network. Small kingdoms, opportunistic lords, and mercenary bands, previously neutral, were now communicating, sharing intelligence, and forming the early outlines of a coordinated effort against Caitlin's dominion. Unlike the Eastern Raiders, this emerging alliance was calculating, deliberate, and patient. They had observed the realm's defenses, noted the discipline of Darien's fleets, and understood that victory would require more than brute force. It would require cunning, misdirection, and exploitation of internal divisions. Inside the council chambers, unease settled over the gathered advisors. Some argued that the external coalition should be met with overwhelming force immediately, a preemptive strike to demonstrate dominance. Others counseled caution, warning that overextension could open gaps for opportunistic enemies to exploit. The room buzzed with underlying tension. The council's debates were no longer merely about strategy. They were about influence, ambition, and positioning. Every suggestion carried the potential to elevate or diminish one's standing. Darien, as always, had anticipated this dynamic. "We cannot fight what we cannot see," he said evenly, leaning over the maps spread across the council table. "Any premature action risks revealing our strength to enemies who are still assembling. Our advantage lies in preparation, intelligence, and control over the terrain. We act when the coalition has exposed its vulnerabilities, not before." Caitlin listened, noting not only the wisdom in Darien's strategy, but also the subtle implication of authority it carried. The council's eyes were on him, but increasingly, they hung on every word of Darien, the young commander whose competence had begun to eclipse formal rank. Caitlin recognized the danger. The external threats were tangible, but the internal pressures, the perception of who truly controlled the realm, were equally critical. Missteps here could fracture the council from within before the enemy even made a move. Reports soon confirmed that the coalition was not waiting idly. Scouts intercepted messages indicating coordinated movements. Mercenary units were hired to harass supply lines. Envoys were being sent to smaller lords to secure allegiance, and there were hints of clandestine operations designed to destabilize trade networks. The coalition's intent was clear. They aimed not only to challenge Caitlin militarily, but to exploit any fracture within the realm itself. Darien proposed a dual approach. First, a series of controlled demonstrations of strength. Patrols along vulnerable trade routes, visible maneuvers near key ports, and selective skirmishes to disrupt communication and supply without fully committing the fleet. Second, covert intelligence operations to infiltrate the coalition's networks, gather information about leadership, logistics, and intent, and identify weaknesses that could be exploited decisively. Caitlin approved, recognizing the brilliance of a plan that would neutralize the external threat while maintaining internal cohesion. The execution began immediately. Fleets moved with precision along the major rivers and channels, showing strength where needed, withdrawing before overexposure could create risk. Scouts reported back daily, providing details of enemy movements, shifts in alliances, and even internal disagreements among the coalition's leaders. Every action reinforced the perception that Darien was in command of operational strategy, further solidifying his reputation with both council and citizens alike. Meanwhile, the political undercurrents grew more complex. Some council members began whispering concerns to one another. Was Caitlin too deferential to Darien? Was the young commander's influence becoming disproportionate? And among merchants and port authorities, confidence in Darien's decisions sometimes surpassed confidence in the Duke himself. Caitlin had anticipated some of this, but the speed and intensity of perception growth were sharper than expected. Authority in the realm was no longer a static hierarchy. It was fluid, and every victory or maneuver altered the balance. One evening, Caitlin summoned Darien to the high observation tower overlooking the harbor. Lanterns flickered against the stone walls, casting elongated shadows across maps and instruments. You are doing what is necessary, but the perception of authority is shifting. Every intercepted coalition message, every patrol, every skirmish you execute, it shapes how the realm sees you. That influence can stabilize or destabilize, depending on how it is managed. Darien considered this quietly. I understand. My focus has been on neutralizing the threat and preserving the realm. Influence is a consequence of success, not the goal. I will act with discretion. Caitlin nodded, but knew that discretion alone could not manage perception. He would need to navigate the delicate balance of guiding Darien's actions without undermining his effectiveness. A subtle dance of power and trust that, if mishandled, could weaken the realm from within more than any external enemy. Could as days passed, intelligence indicated that the coalition's coordination was beginning to strain. Mistrust and competing ambitions among the allied lords slowed their movements, creating opportunities for Caitlin and Darien to apply pressure. Targeted interdictions disrupted supply lines, and visible naval maneuvers forced the coalition to reconsider overextension. Skirmishes continued along the outer passages, each engagement small but strategically significant, designed to probe and fracture the coalition's cohesion without provoking an all-out battle prematurely. Yet amidst these successes, the internal politics of the council demanded careful management. Reports of Darien's efficiency and decisiveness were filtering back to key advisors who had long-standing ambitions of influence, and some began to test boundaries, subtly questioning Caitlin's decisions, proposing alternative strategies, or attempting to curry favor with Darien directly. The delicate balance of loyalty, authority, and perception was now as critical as any fleet deployment or river blockade. The stage was set for a critical turning point. The coalition, sensing pressure and vulnerability, would soon attempt a coordinated strike against one of the realm's outermost trade hubs. Darien had anticipated this, and plans were in place for rapid interception. But the success of that operation would depend not only on tactical precision, but also on managing the increasingly intricate web of internal politics, ensuring that unity and trust held under the pressure of both external and internal threats. The sun rose over the outermost trade hub, a bustling port that had become a lifeline for the realm's economy and a symbolic target for the coalition. Merchants hurried to secure goods, citizens prepared for the worst, and the garrison, though well-trained, felt the weight of anticipation. The coalition had been patient, calculating, and now they struck, sending mercenary detachments and allied lords' troops, converging from multiple directions in a coordinated push that tested both speed and precision. Darien had already positioned his forces. Scouts relayed intelligence in near real time, showing the advancing units, their formation, and their likely approach. The plan, meticulously rehearsed in both simulations and smaller skirmishes, called for a layered response. First, fast-moving patrols would engage and slow the attackers, channeling them into narrow passes and river crossings. Second, the fleet's main forces would arrive at decisive points, using superior maneuvering and coordinated firepower to overwhelm the enemy in confined spaces. Third, reserves would be poised to cut off retreat or reinforce faltering fronts as the First Coalition. Detachments approached, the outer patrols engaged. Archers and light cavalry executed hit-and-run maneuvers, drawing the enemy into ambush points. The initial clash was violent but controlled. Darien's strategy relied on discipline, timing, and terrain, and it was executed flawlessly. The attackers, expecting disorganized resistance, found themselves forced into kill zones where crossbows and strategically positioned infantry inflicted significant damage. Meanwhile, Caitlin observed from a vantage point near the fortified center of the hub. Messages from his advisors arrived continuously. The outer patrols reported progress, supply lines were secure, and civilian morale held steady. Yet the council murmured among themselves, some still questioning Darien's decisions, others fearing that too much reliance on the young commander was giving him undue authority. Caitlin understood that the cohesion of his forces was fragile. External success would only matter if internal trust held up by mid-morning. The coalition's main force reached the first choke point, a narrow river crossing guarded by well-positioned infantry and supported by naval units capable of rapid redeployment. What had begun as a confident advance turned into confusion and disarray. Cavalry units that had been the backbone of the coalition's strategy were funneled into positions where they could not maneuver effectively, while infantry faced concentrated volleys from both sides. Darien's coordination of land and river forces proved decisive. The coalition's numerical advantage was neutralized by discipline, terrain, and the timing of counterattacks. Simultaneously, scouts intercepted messages revealing cracks in the coalition's cohesion. Some mercenary captains doubted their lord's judgment, others debated retreat, and small units became hesitant to engage without clear orders. Darien recognized this opportunity. Rather than pressing recklessly, he orchestrated controlled pressure, continuous harassment, and strategic positioning that maintained coalition uncertainty while conserving his own forces. The psychological effect was immediate. Hesitation spread faster than the attacks themselves. By afternoon, the coalition's coordinated strike had collapsed into fragmented skirmishes. Units that were meant to converge on the hub instead found themselves isolated, facing concentrated resistance at multiple points simultaneously. Darien's layered approach allowed Caitlin to intervene precisely where needed, reinforcing threatened sectors while leaving other units free to continue the containment strategy. The realm's forces moved as one, synchronized in timing and execution, while the coalition struggled to respond effectively to a battle that had been anticipated, dissected, and countered. Even as the battlefield shifted, internal politics remained in play. Some council members who had doubted Darien now acknowledged his skill, while others quietly recalibrated their ambitions, realizing that successful operations under Caitlin's oversight strengthened both leaders. Caitlin observed this with cautious satisfaction. Influence had to be managed carefully, but in this case, the external threat had realigned priorities, forcing cooperation and mitigating internal rivalries at least temporarily by sunset. The coalition's remnants were either captured, scattered, or forced into retreat. The trade hub remained secure, its fortifications and coordinated defense proving decisive. Victory was significant not only militarily, but psychologically. The coalition had assumed the realm would be divided, reactive, and vulnerable, only to find their strike anticipated, countered, and neutralized efficiently. Caitlin and Darien convened at the port later that evening. Lanterns reflected off the water, and the air was heavy with smoke from scattered skirmishes. Caitlin allowed himself a rare moment of relief. "You've executed flawlessly," he said. The coalition believed in their numerical advantage, in their coordination, and yet they'd been broken before the day was half over. Darien's response was measured. "We prepared, anticipated, and adapted. They expected our division, our hesitation, and instead found discipline and planning. that will force them to reconsider their approach for any future moves. Caitlin nodded, knowing the coming days would bring more challenges. The coalition had not been destroyed, only delayed and fractured. Their ambitions persisted, and their networks remained intact in more distant territories. What had been achieved was not final victory, but a demonstration of the realm's readiness, discipline, and strategic foresight. Even as the hub streets filled with citizens celebrating safety, Caitlin and Darien understood that this was only the opening chapter. The coalition would learn, adapt, and attempt new strategies. Within the council, influence and authority continued to shift subtly with every success, every observation, and every decision. The balance of power, both external and internal, remained dynamic, and the next confrontation would test not just military skill, but leadership, foresight, and the cohesion of a realm under pressure from all sides. Winter had deepened, the rivers partially frozen and the forest dusted in frost, but the realm was far from dormant. The coalition, having suffered its humiliating defeat at the trade hub, had regrouped in scattered territories, attempting to rebuild morale and coordinate another strike. This time, their approach was more sophisticated. Multi-pronged movements, simultaneous raids, and overtures to neutral lords who might supply additional troops. They believed cunning and surprise could overcome the discipline that had thwarted them before. But Caitlin and Darien had anticipated not only the enemy's movements, but the lessons the coalition would attempt to exploit. Intelligence networks monitored every path, every message, and every shift in allegiance. Scouts penetrated even the most cautious enemy camps, gathering precise information about troop movements and morale. Unlike before, there was no element of surprise for the coalition. They were stepping into a realm prepared on every front. As the coalition advanced again, the first signs of failure appeared immediately. Small detachments sent to test defenses were intercepted, contained, and neutralized before they could achieve objectives. Attempts to bribe local authorities or rally neutral lords were thwarted by a combination of timely diplomacy and demonstrations of force. The coalition's coordination, once its greatest asset, began unraveling under the pressure of constant surveillance, rapid countermeasures, and precise strikes. The climactic confrontation came when the largest coalition force, moving from the north, attempted to converge on the heart of the realm, hoping to draw Caitlin and Darien into a battle that might fracture their command. Instead, the realm's forces executed a masterful pincer maneuver. Darien, commanding the central forces, allowed the coalition to advance into terrain deliberately chosen to favor defenders. Narrow valleys, frozen rivers, and elevated battlements channeled the attackers into confined spaces where numerical advantage counted for little. Crossbows, catapults, and disciplined infantry tore into the enemy as they tried to maneuver. Meanwhile, Caitlin led a rapid flanking force from the south, catching the coalition's rear guard in a devastating surprise. Panic rippled through the enemy lines. What had been coordinated strikes became a chaotic retreat. Commanders were cut off from their subordinates. Units disintegrated under relentless pressure, and morale collapsed entirely. By nightfall, the coalition had suffered annihilation across every front. Thousands captured, leaders killed, and remnants fleeing into distant forests with no hope of regrouping. The realm stood victorious. But Caitlin understood that the victory was more than tactical. It was cultural, psychological, and lasting. The people had witnessed disciplined leadership, strategic foresight, and unity in the face of overwhelming external pressure. Internal divisions, once a source of potential disaster, had been contained through the alignment of authority, mutual trust, and the demonstration that shared purpose outweighed individual ambition. The council, now united, recognized both Caitlin's wisdom and Darien's brilliance, creating a stable governance structure that would endure long after the battlefields were silent. News of the realm's triumph spread beyond borders. Neighboring territories marveled at the disciplined coordination and the intelligence-driven strategies that had allowed a smaller, more defensive power to defeat a coalition that had assumed it would dominate. Caitlin and Darien's names became synonymous with foresight, adaptability, and leadership that could transform a near defeat into an unforgettable victory. Years later, the story of the Winter Campaign was told and retold, not just as a tale of battle, but as a lesson in resilience and strategy. Citizens celebrated annual commemorations, reenacting key maneuvers and honoring those who had held the walls, navigated the rivers, and led the decisive strikes. Scholars and chroniclers recorded not only the victories, but the underlying principles, the value of learning from past mistakes, the power of preparation, the decisive impact of disciplined execution, and the enduring importance of unity under competent leadership. The legacy was clear. Caitlin and Darien had transformed what could have been another era of devastation into a defining moment of the realm's history. The coalition never threatened the territory again. Other powers, having observed the realm's success, adjusted their strategies, respecting both its military capability and the intelligence behind its decisions. More than a military triumph, the campaign had forged a national identity, a sense of shared purpose, and a story that would echo through generations. A testament to the idea that even the most formidable challenges could be met and overcome with foresight, coordination, and unyielding resolve. And so, the realm endured. Its people remembered, celebrated, and drew inspiration from the time when adversity tested them to the core, only to be met with preparation, courage, and leadership that refused to surrender. The coalition's defeat became legend, the Winter Campaign a defining narrative of resilience, and the names of Caitlin and Darien forever etched in history, not merely as victors of battle, but as architects of a legacy that would never be forgotten. The lesson remained timeless. The unstoppable can be stopped, not by luck or sudden fortune, but by learning, adapting, and standing together when the world expects you to fall. History remembers those who survive, who prepare, who act with both courage and wisdom, and who transform terror into triumph. And in the annals of the realm, no story shines brighter, no legacy endures longer than that winter of trials, victories, and unbreakable resolve. The story ends not with a final clash, but with a quiet, profound truth. Resilience, foresight, and unity leave a mark that conquest alone cannot erase.